Summer 1940. While Europe burned, the U.S. Army still moved by horse. Staff cars bogged in mud, motorcycles snapped ankles in ruts. At Fort Benning, a colonel slammed his fist on a table and barked, "We need a mechanical mule, something that never quits." The request went out to every automaker in America. Four-wheel drive, quarter-ton load, under 1,300 pounds, 50 miles per hour, in 75 days. Detroit laughed. Only one tiny company answered, Bantam, a bankrupt firm in Butler, Pennsylvania. Its last engineer, Karl Probst, drew the prototype in 48 hours, slept on the floor, and delivered it in 49 days. The Army officer who tested it came back mud-splattered, grinning. "Gentlemen, this damn thing climbs trees." Bantam had built the impossible, but the Army feared a bankrupt outfit couldn't mass-produce. The blueprints went to Willys-Overland in Ohio and Ford in Michigan. They refined the design, each copying the other until every bolt matched. Soldiers mashed the Ford code GP into a single syllable, Jeep. The Willys MB looked like a bad joke beside German machines. Flat hood, open cab, no doors, no armor. The Go Devil engine pushed 60 horsepower, barely enough to move a small tractor. Yet it could ford 2 feet of water, climb a 45-degree hill, and pull a trailer its own weight. Everything served function. Flat fenders for men to sit or fire from, fold-down windshield for glare or shrapnel, identical bolts throughout so any wrench fit any part. A mechanic in Tunisia said, "It's not built, it's assembled from courage." In the Reich, engineers built masterpieces. Every panzer part was tuned like a piano string. In America, factories ran like hammers. Willys and Ford turned out a Jeep every 90 seconds. At full tilt, U.S. industry produced more Jeeps per month than Germany built tanks in a year. Detroit's motto became, "Don't polish, produce." Each cost $738, half the price of a Kubelwagen, a quarter of a Panzer track. A Tiger tank required 300,000 man-hours. A Jeep took 11. It was quantity weaponized, industrial Darwinism. November 1942, Operation Torch. The first wave landed in Algeria and Morocco. Among them, thousands of Jeeps. The Germans saw them and howled. Spielzugautos, toy cars. But the toy cars didn't stop. They bounced over wadis where half-tracks buried their noses. They carried medics, ammo, and commanders through sand that swallowed everything else. The British SAS stripped off windshields, bolted twin Brownings to the hoods, and raided airfields at night. When dawn came, German mechanics found shredded Junkers and shell casings stamped Willys. A captured Africa Corps report admitted, "Enemy light car operates beyond our understanding. It moves where tracked vehicles are required." Rommel himself appropriated one, repainting it gray with black crosses. His staff called it Der kleine Amerikaner, the little American. The German Kubelwagen, Ferdinand Porsche's child, was efficient, tidy, air-cooled, and hopelessly polite. Two-wheel drive, designed for roads in a war without them. In mud it spun, in sand it buried. The Jeep, brutal and unsophisticated, simply clawed forward. A Wehrmacht engineer watching a captured Jeep climb a dune muttered, "That is not engineering, that is stubbornness on wheels." Soldiers anthropomorphized it instantly. They named them Betsy, Mud Dog, Faithful Flo. A GI wrote home, "If my Jeep had tits, I'd marry her." Mechanics patched radiators with chewing gum, replaced pistons with soup cans. And it still ran. No armor, no fear. War creates symbols. The Jeep became America's. Eisenhower would later call it one of the 3 decisive weapons of World War II, alongside the Dakota and the bazooka. By spring 43, Jeeps led every Allied advance across North Africa. They outran supply lines, mapped minefields, evacuated wounded. German radio intercepts recorded frantic calls. "Small enemy cars behind our lines, impossible. Request immediate air support." There was no stopping them. The desert belonged to the machine that was never meant to exist. June 1943. Sicily baked under 40-degree heat. Columns of Shermans crawled up hairpin roads, engines gasping, while jeeps darted past like insects. The invasion had shown one thing: amphibious war lived or died by mobility after the beach. At Gala, paratroopers dropped in chaos, their radios smashed on landing. Within an hour, Navy beach parties unloaded wooden crates marked Vehicle 1/4 ton 4x4. Mechanics assembled jeeps with mallets and pocket knives. By dawn, comms officers were bouncing across the island, linking scattered units. What horses and dispatch riders once did in days, the jeep did before breakfast. When the Italian campaign began, the mountains became the enemy. Tank treads spun uselessly on gravel roads. The jeep climbed goat trails. At Salerno, they towed mountain guns where mules had died. At Anzio, medics strapped 2 stretchers on metal brackets and turned the jeep into an ambulance. A wounded private later recalled, "That engine was the best sound I ever heard. I figured if a jeep could find me, the war couldn't kill me." Field improvisation turned the jeep into a shapeshifter. Engineers discovered it could carry a radio generator, pull a 37mm gun, or mount twin .30s. Pilots used them as tugs for aircraft, priests as mobile altars, generals as command cars. The British even built amphibious jeeps, the Seep, that floated badly but bravely across rivers. The Germans watched through binoculars, incredulous. Reports from the Gustav Line read, "Small American vehicle crosses ground unsuitable for armor, reaches heights we cannot shell, suggest heavy fire on mountain roads." But the mountain roads were too narrow for panzers. Only the jeep fit. The Allies didn't just outfight the Wehrmacht, they outmoved it. By 1943, the jeep had a reputation bordering on superstition. Soldiers joked that the only way to kill it was to run out of war. In one test, an Army unit drove a jeep 11,000 miles across the U.S. without a breakdown. The Go Devil engine could run with bullet holes, water in the oil, even missing spark plugs. Crews learned to swap engines in 3 hours and tires in 90 seconds. Compare that with a Tiger tank. Maintenance nightmare, fuel-hungry diva of steel. The jeep drank anything that burned and kept coughing forward. American supply officers called it the cockroach of transport, indestructible, multiplying everywhere. When Allied troops rolled into Rome on June 4, 1944, the first vehicle through the Porta Maggiore wasn't a tank. It was a jeep with a hand-painted sign, "First in Rome." Photos of it hit newspapers worldwide. The symbolism was perfect, small, unarmored, democratic. The jeep became the face of liberation, freedom on 4 wheels. Meanwhile, the Soviets were begging Washington for more. Stalin personally requested 35,000 jeeps under Lend-Lease. Red Army drivers renamed it the Amerikansky Kozel, the American goat. It climbed everywhere goats climbed, and sometimes higher. In North Africa, the Germans had laughed. In Italy, they cursed. On the Eastern Front, they envied. The little box of steel had become a global phenomenon, and it was just getting started. Spring 1944, England was a parking lot of jeeps. Every hedgerow hid one, every airfield bristled with them. Mechanics slept under them. Commanders held conferences sitting on hoods. Eisenhower called it the tool that won the war before the war was even finished. When D-Day came, the jeep led the invasion. The first vehicle to crawl off the landing craft at Omaha was a Willys MB carrying medics. Bullets tore the canvas seats. It kept going, splashing through surf, dragging wounded to cover. By nightfall, hundreds more were rolling inland on plank bridges and cratered lanes. Normandy's bocage was a maze of mud and roots. Tanks couldn't turn, trucks couldn't pass, but jeeps, light, narrow, agile, slipped through farm gates and carried messages under fire. Drivers became heroes. One sergeant guided artillery fire by standing on his seat, using the jeep's windshield as a sight. German infantry learned to fear that sputtering sound in the distance. It meant spotters were close, artillery minutes away. Captured prisoners later said, "The small car was worse than the tanks. Tanks you could hear for miles. The jeep appeared like a ghost and vanished, and then shells fell. Every Allied branch had claimed it. The Army used it for recon. The Air Force used it to haul bombs. The Navy used it on carriers as tugs. Even reporters used it as mobile offices. A Jeep could carry 4 men or 10 if nobody cared about physics. It could tow a field gun, deliver mail, or serve as a parade float for liberated towns. Kids rode on the hood. Nuns blessed it. Dogs slept under it. By late 1944, Wehrmacht intelligence reports admitted defeat in the mobility war. American light cars operate in terrain previously considered impassable. Our armored cars cannot pursue. Recommend development of equivalent. They never managed to build one. The German war machine was too obsessed with complexity. The Jeep was complexity's opposite, perfection through subtraction. By autumn, every photograph of the Western Front showed the same silhouette: square hood, upright grille, grinning driver. The Jeep wasn't just a vehicle, it was a message. To civilians hiding in ruins, it said, "The Allies are here." To German soldiers, it said, "You're out of places to hide." England, spring 1944. Every hedgerow, every meadow, every airfield in southern England bristled with Jeeps. They were everywhere, lined up like ants on steel runways, parked nose to nose outside tents, rumbling along lanes choked with invasion traffic. The little Willys had become the heartbeat of Operation Overlord. A corporal in the 101st Airborne wrote home, "If you see a man without a Jeep over here, he's either an officer with a driver or a ghost." Factories back in the States were feeding the invasion like arteries. By May, Willis and Ford were shipping 4,000 Jeeps a week across the Atlantic. Each was covered in cosmoline, packed with spare parts, and stenciled simply, "Vehicle, 1/4 of a ton, 4x4. They rolled off ships in Liverpool, were tuned in the rain, and sent south to the marshalling camps. Commanders planned invasions from Jeep hoods. Eisenhower toured the troops in one, pipe in hand, smiling through the exhaust. General Patton stood on the seat of his, megaphone raised, shouting orders across entire convoys. British and American mechanics began joking that the Army had only 2 ranks now: those who drove Jeeps and those who wanted to. When D-Day arrived, the first vehicle to touch French sand wasn't a tank or a truck. It was a Jeep packed with medics from the 16th Infantry. Surf poured over its hood. Bullets punched through its canvas seats, and still it crawled forward. Behind it came more, plowing through seawater and wreckage, towing supplies, dragging wounded men out of the tide. By dusk, hundreds were inland, headlights taped, engines sputtering, carrying the invasion on 4 muddy wheels. A German officer watching from the cliffs muttered, "They're ants, small, endless, unstoppable." Normandy's bocage was a nightmare. Ancient earthen banks topped with hedges thick enough to stop a tank. For days, the Sherman crews fought to move a mile. The Jeeps slipped through farm gates, down cow paths, across fields, acting as lifelines between units. Each regiment had runner drivers who memorized the landscape by instinct. They raced through shell fire, carried dispatches when radios failed, ferried commanders who couldn't risk a column. Some drove 30 missions a day. The infantry nicknamed them suicide chauffeurs. Sergeant Bill Baldwin of the 29th Division recalled, "We drove like thieves, dodging between hedgerows while mortars fell. You could smell the dirt kicked up by bullets. The Jeep didn't care. It just wanted to go." Captured diaries from the 352nd Infantry Division recorded the first impressions. The small American cars are uncanny. They appear suddenly in the fields, vanish again, always carrying officers who summon artillery fire. Our soldiers shoot at them constantly but seldom hit. They are too fast. The Wehrmacht began setting traps, strings of wire across roads, mines under bridges, anything to stop the pests. Nothing worked for long. Engineers filled craters with rubble, and the Jeeps bounced across as if insulted by the obstacle. The invasion's success depended on adaptation, and the Jeep embodied it. Reconnaissance, small patrols scouted beyond the line, the Jeep's silhouettes blending with hedges. Evacuation, 2 stretcher brackets turned it into an ambulance. Anti-aircraft, twin .30s mounted on rear poles could shred low-flying fighters. Command. A radio jeep could direct naval gunfire onto targets 20 miles away. The same design performed 100 jobs without redesign. No German vehicle could claim that. Tanks thundered. Trucks groaned. The jeep talked. Its small four-cylinder beat, half snarl, half cough, became the soundtrack of liberation. Civilians learned to recognize it instantly. In village after village, French children ran into the streets shouting, "Les Américains." They'd heard that engine before they saw the flag. For soldiers, the sound meant life. If a jeep could reach you, supplies could, medics could, hope could. Pilots shot down behind lines, listened for that offbeat rhythm through the forest. One wrote later, "When I heard that little motor sputtering up the trail, I knew I was going home." By August 1944, the Wehrmacht had lost France's roads and most of its fuel. Reports from Army Group B complained, "Enemy light vehicles penetrate terrain inaccessible to our columns. Even our motorcycles cannot pursue. They carry machine guns, radios, and officers directing fighter bombers. Their presence precedes destruction." The once laughable toy car had become a herald of death. A jeep sighted on a ridge usually meant artillery shells within minutes. Behind the front, the jeep transformed warfare's slowest art, supply. Convoys of them hauled ammunition, water, and mail faster than trucks could. Each battalion had dozens weaving between columns like bees. Fuel drums, rations, spare parts, all moved on these nimble frames. Commanders realized they no longer needed roads. They could create their own network of mobility. An officer wrote in his field log, "With these little devils, we have shortened war's geography. Terrain no longer decides, time does." When Paris was liberated in August 1944, crowds surged around jeeps carrying GIs through the boulevards. Flowers rained onto the hoods. People kissed mud-splattered drivers. Photographers captured the moment. And suddenly the world saw what liberation looked like. A smiling soldier in an open jeep, wind in his hair, freedom on his face. Newsreels crossed the Atlantic. American audiences roared. The jeep had gone from factory tool to icon. Ford dealers began displaying captured German helmets on jeeps in their showrooms with the sign, "This machine crossed Europe while the Nazis were still checking the oil." By autumn, Allied doctrine had changed. Infantry moved on jeeps instead of trucks. Paratroopers carried folding versions and gliders. They'd hit the ground, cut the ropes, start the engine, and roll straight into combat. No assembly required. German officers watching from hedgerows couldn't believe it. Lieutenant Hans Keller wrote to his wife, "The Americans have found a way to turn industry into legs. Their small cars run faster than our thoughts. I fear them more than the tanks." As the Allies advanced toward Belgium, the logistical tail stretched hundreds of miles. The jeep became the courier of empire, delivering orders, dragging cable, guiding convoys. Mechanics joked that if the front ever reached Berlin, it would be a jeep driver who arrived first. When the Red Ball Express began, Allied supply lines running day and night from Normandy to the front, jeep convoys acted as scouts, clearing the route. One driver said, "We were the headlights of the war." By late 1944, the jeep wasn't just a vehicle, it was doctrine. It represented the shift from static warfare to speed, from fortresses to movement. The Germans built fortifications, the Americans built momentum. An Allied strategist summarized it best: "Our tanks win battles, our jeeps win wars." The laughter that began in Africa had long since died. In Normandy's mud, in France's hedgerows, in the shattered streets of Paris, the jeep proved a truth that every empire learns too late. The smallest engine can drive the greatest change. December 1944, Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Snow fell like ash on the frozen pines. The roads were ice ruts lined with wreckage, tanks half buried in drifts, soldiers wrapped in blankets instead of uniforms. Engines froze solid, guns jammed. The war slowed to a crawl, except for the one sound that still echoed through the trees. That uneven, sputtering four-cylinder cough, A Jeep fighting the cold like a living thing. The Battle of the Bulge would become the Jeep's crucible. No other vehicle could survive it. No truck could climb the icy hills. No tank could maneuver in the woods. But the quarter-ton Willys kept moving, sometimes the only thing moving at all. Temperatures plunged to 25 degrees C. Fuel turned to jelly. Mechanics lit fires under crankcases to thaw the oil, poured coffee over carburetors, urinated on frozen locks. Every morning sounded like a choir of curses as soldiers begged their machines to start. Yet somehow the Jeeps woke up. The Go Devil engine, just 134 cubic inches, was too simple to quit. No fragile injectors, no electric starters to freeze. A manual crank, a prayer, and it sputtered to life. "She don't like it," one GI muttered, "but she'll do it." Even when pistons seized from cold, men towed one Jeep with another until the heat of motion thawed it. The vehicles seemed to share their endurance. Platoons called them our steel mules. Communication lines snapped under artillery. Radios failed. Roads vanished. The only link between scattered units was the Jeep. Drivers tore through snowdrifts under shell fire to deliver orders, dragging wounded men back in the same run. They carried plasma, ammo, food, and sometimes hope itself. Sergeant James Bowers of the 101st Airborne later said, "The Jeep was our lifeline. When we heard one grinding up the road, we knew we weren't forgotten. Trucks couldn't get through, but that little bastard could." Medical teams lashed stretchers across the hood and rear, turning them into field ambulances. In Bastogne, surrounded and freezing, medics evacuated hundreds of wounded on Jeeps. Nurses wrapped themselves in blankets, clinging to the rails, while snow whipped their faces. Drivers called it riding death with headlights off. The Ardennes offensive unleashed 200,000 German troops and over 1,000 tanks. The skies were grounded by blizzards. On the ground, the Jeep became the eyes of the Allied defense. Recon squads crept behind lines, engines muffled, headlights painted black. They brought back maps, coordinates, and prisoners. One German officer captured near St. Vith said during interrogation, "We fired at shadows, but they moved faster than we could aim. It was like the forest itself was full of them." When fog cleared, the Jeep worked with air support. Forward observers rode to ridge lines, radioed coordinates, and called in Thunderbolts and Mustangs. The enemy began to associate the sound of a Jeep engine with death from the sky. The drivers paid for that mobility. Frostbite turned their hands to stone. Steering wheels froze to gloves. Seats became sheets of ice. Windshields were removed because frost trapped too much glare. Men wrapped burlap around engines to keep heat in, and used rifle grease on the transmissions. Every trip risked an ambush or a mine. Yet volunteers lined up for driving duty because movement was the only thing that made the cold bearable. A soldier in the 28th Infantry said, "Better to freeze rolling than freeze waiting." The German armor, Panthers, Tigers, was deadly in open fields. In the snow-choked woods, their size was a curse. The Jeep's small frame wove between trunks, over ditches, through gaps barely wider than its fenders. It carried bazooka teams who stalked tanks like hunters. Many German crews never even saw the shots that killed them. Colonel Charles Young of the 2nd Armored Division wrote in his after-action report, "Our heavy armor held the line. Our Jeeps found it. Without them, we would have been blind." When Patton's 3rd Army turned north to relieve Bastogne, his supply chain was pure improvisation. Frozen bridges, broken fuel lines, roads cratered by bombs. The Jeep led every convoy, scouting paths through snowfields, hauling engineers to dig out trucks. They ran 20 hours a day. Engines never shut off, lest they freeze. Drivers painted slogans on hoods. "This machine runs on guts." Mechanics joked that the Jeeps were like donkeys. They'd go anywhere, but only for someone who yelled louder than the war. When the weather finally cleared, Allied aircraft spotted the little vehicles dotting the landscape like steel breadcrumbs, marking the road to victory. Captured German communications after the Bulge revealed something astonishing. One transcript read, "The American light vehicle continues to operate in impossible conditions. Snow, mud, water, Nothing stops it. It carries radio, supplies, and artillery observers. Destroy all if possible. They are the nerve system of the enemy. In the same file, an officer scribbled in pencil, "Impossible. They are everywhere." By early 1945, German morale was crumbling. The mighty tanks that once defined blitzkrieg were now statues of ice, abandoned for lack of fuel. The jeeps, running on anything combustible, roamed freely through the wreckage of the Reich's last gamble. The jeep wasn't just a machine, it was company. Soldiers talked to it, cursed it, sang to it. They covered the dash with photos of wives and pinup girls. They thanked it for every safe trip. It gave them a feeling no tank could control. In a war of chaos, it was something they could command with their own hands. Private Ed Harkins wrote in his diary, "If this thing had a heartbeat, I'd swear it was mine." By February, the snow began to melt. The jeep tracks, millions of them, ran like scars through Belgium's forests. They had carried food to the starving, ammo to the front, hope to the surrounded. Mechanics counted losses. Of 12,000 jeeps used in the Ardennes, only 3,000 were destroyed. Most died from overwork, not enemy fire. The rest rolled east, mud replacing snow, their engines rumbling toward the Rhine. Behind them lay a frozen graveyard of machines that couldn't adapt. The jeep had done what no Panzer, no truck, no half-track could. Kept moving, when war itself froze solid. As Allied columns crossed the Rhine in March 1945, Patton stood on the east bank and grinned. His jeep idled beside him, mud up to the headlights. "Get me to Berlin," he said, "before this thing wears out.